The moment my brother raised his champagne glass and said, "Even failures deserve a seat somewhere," the entire table laughed. Not loudly, not cruelly, just enough. Just enough for me to feel it settle in my chest like a stone. I remember the exact smell in the room when it happened. Roses and butter from the catered chicken, mixed with the faint sweetness of champagne. Garrett and Leela's wedding reception was being held in one of those glass-walled ballrooms overlooking the river. The kind of place where every surface gleams and every guest seems perfectly polished. Everyone looked beautiful. Everyone except the woman sitting at table 17. Me. Table 17 was positioned so far back that the centerpieces looked like tiny dots of candlelight across the room. From where I sat, Garrett and Lila looked less like people and more like characters in a stage play. And somehow, that felt appropriate, because that had always been the story of my life. Garrett was the golden child. I was the afterthought. I took a slow sip of the sparkling water in front of me and pretended the comment hadn't landed like a slap. Garrett continued his speech with the easy confidence that had followed him his entire life. He stood tall in his tuxedo, one hand casually tucked in his pocket as he thanked our parents, his new in-laws, his co-workers from Sterling Partners, and the long list of friends who had helped make the wedding possible. He spoke like a man who had never doubted his place in the world. My mother dabbed her eyes delicately with a napkin as he praised her for being the strong backbone of the family. My father leaned back proudly in his chair, nodding along. When Garrett joked about the time he broke his arm playing high school football, the entire room erupted in laughter. When he mentioned graduating top of his business program, people clapped. Then he took a small sip of champagne and glanced around the room with that familiar grin. "And of course," he said, "we can't forget my little sister, Paige." A few heads turned toward my table. I straightened slightly in my chair. For one small, fragile second, I thought maybe he was going to say something kind. And Garrett chuckled. "You know, every family needs balance. You've got the achievers, and then you've got the people who teach you humility." A few people laughed softly. Garrett raised his glass again. "Even failures deserve a seat somewhere." That was the line. That was the moment. And judging by the quick sideways glances and polite smiles, most of the room assumed it was just harmless sibling teasing. But if you've spent your whole life being the family disappointment, you know the difference. You can hear it in the tone. You can feel it in the room. I lowered my eyes to the white tablecloth and traced the rim of my glass with my finger. Across the ballroom, Garrett was still talking, but I couldn't hear him anymore. Because suddenly I was 10 years old again, sitting at the kitchen table while my parents praised Garrett for his perfect math scores. I was 17 again, watching Garrett open acceptance letters while my own grades struggled to keep up. I was 21 again, packing my things after quietly dropping out of college. That had been the moment the label became permanent: failure. The word wasn't spoken often, but it was understood. After that, family conversations about me always carried the same gentle tone people use when discussing something unfortunate but inevitable. Paige just needs to find herself. Some people aren't built for academic pressure. At least Garrett will be able to help her someday. I stood slowly from my chair before the speech ended. But it didn't matter enough to interrupt the applause when Garrett finished. I slipped past a group of distant cousins and headed toward the exit hallway. The music from the live band had started up again, something jazzy and bright. My heels clicked softly against the marble floor. Outside the ballroom doors, the hallway was quiet. Kool-Aid. The air smelled faintly like lemon cleaning polish. I leaned against the wall and let out a long breath. I hadn't realized I was holding. It's strange how humiliation doesn't always arrive with anger. Sometimes it arrives with something quieter. Relief. Because moments like that confirm something you've known for years. You stop hoping, you stop trying, and maybe you finally start leaving. I reached into my small clutch purse for my car keys. That's when I heard a voice behind me. "Excuse me." The man walking toward me was tall, probably in his early 40s, with dark hair threaded lightly with silver at the temples. His suit was tailored in that effortless way that suggested it probably cost more than my car. But it wasn't the suit that caught my attention. It was the expression on his face. Recognition. The kind that makes your stomach tighten before your brain catches up. "I'm sorry to stop you," he said, offering a polite smile, "but I just wanted to make sure I wasn't mistaken." I blinked. "About what?" He extended his hand. "Marcus Webb." The name rang faintly in my memory, then it clicked. Marcus Webb, CEO of Sterling Partners. Garrett's boss. My stomach twisted. Great. Another person from Garrett's perfect world. I shook his hand anyway. "Paige Denavon." His smile widened slightly. "Yes," he said gently. "I know." There was a pause. Then he said something that made the ground beneath my carefully quiet life shift just a little. "You're the founder of Summit Learning Technologies." Not a question. A statement. For a second, I couldn't speak, because for the past 8 years, almost no one in my family had asked what I did for a living. Most of them assumed I worked some vague tech support job somewhere in Seattle, and I had never corrected them. Marcus tilted his head slightly, studying my reaction. "I've been hoping to meet you," he said. I stared at him. "You have." He gave a small, respectful nod. Then he said something no one in my family had ever said to me before. "It's an honor, ma'am." And suddenly, the night wasn't quite what anyone in that ballroom thought it was. For a moment, I honestly thought Marcus Webb had confused me with someone else. That happens sometimes in big hotels and crowded events. People see a familiar face and attach the wrong name to it. But Marcus wasn't hesitating. He stood there calmly, hands loosely folded in front of him, studying me with the kind of quiet attentiveness most people reserve for someone important. And I had spent most of my life knowing I wasn't the important one. "I think you might have the wrong person," I said carefully. Marcus's smile deepened just slightly. "No," he replied. "I don't." He glanced briefly back toward the ballroom doors, where Garrett's laughter carried faintly through the music. Then his eyes returned to me. "You're Paige Donovan, founder and lead architect of Summit Learning Technologies." The words sounded strange coming from someone else's mouth. Like hearing your own name spoken in a language you forgot you understood. I felt a small automatic instinct rise inside me, the same one that had guided me for years. Deflect, downplay, shrink. "It's a small company," I said quietly. Marcus chuckled. "With respect, that's not exactly accurate." The hallway light reflected off the polished floor as he stepped a little closer, lowering his voice. "Summit's adaptive learning platform increased our training completion rates by 40% in the first quarter alone. Our onboarding costs dropped nearly half." He paused. "And the analytics system you built, my entire executive team." Because while my family had spent years discussing Garrett's promotions and bonuses, nobody had ever talked about my work that way. Marcus seemed to notice the hesitation on my face. His voice softened. "I apologize if I surprised you," he said. "But when I saw your name on the guest list tonight, I assumed Garrett had mentioned your company." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because the idea felt absurd. Garrett didn't know. None of them did. Marcus frowned slightly. "He didn't." I shook my head. For a second, the silence between us felt delicate. Then Marcus gave a quiet, thoughtful nod. "I see." He didn't ask questions. He didn't push. And oddly, that made me trust him a little, because people who respect you rarely rush to fill silence. "Finally," he said gently, "would you mind if we talked for a moment?" I hesitated. Part of me still wanted to slip out the door, get into my car, and disappear back into the quiet life I'd built thousands of miles away. But another part of me, one I didn't acknowledge very often, felt curious. So I nodded. We walked down the hallway to a small lounge area overlooking the river. The city lights shimmered on the water outside the tall windows, and the muffled music from the reception drifted faintly through the walls. Marcus sat across from me at a low table. He didn't pull out a phone. He didn't glance at his watch. He just gave me his full attention. "When we first licensed Summit's platform," he said, "I assumed it was developed by a large engineering team." I smiled faintly. "It wasn't." He studied me. "That's what impressed us most." And hearing those words pulled me back, years before this night, before the ballroom, before Garrett's wedding, back to a tiny apartment above a laundromat in Seattle, back to the quiet beginning of the life nobody in my family had bothered to ask about. When I dropped out of college, my parents treated it like a delicate tragedy. Not dramatic, not loud, just disappointing. My mother started speaking to me in that careful voice people use around fragile things. My father avoided the subject entirely. Garrett tried to be supportive in the way older brothers sometimes do, offering practical advice wrapped in subtle superiority. "You'll figure something out," he told me once over dinner. "But you should probably focus on something realistic." Realistic. That word stuck with me. Because what none of them understood was that I hadn't dropped out because I couldn't handle the work. I dropped out because the work wasn't the problem. The system was. My computer science courses taught theory beautifully, but the actual learning platforms universities used were outdated, rigid, and painfully inefficient. The more I studied them, the more the flaws bothered me. Everyone learned differently. Some people needed repetition. Some people needed visual explanations. Some people needed real-time feedback. But most digital training systems treated every learner exactly the same. It felt wasteful. Like building a road. So when I left school, I didn't leave the work behind. I just changed where I did it. During the day, I worked basic tech support for a small software company. It paid enough to cover rent and groceries. At night, I wrote code. At first, it was just experiments. Little algorithms that adjusted lessons based on how someone answered questions. Programs that tracked patterns and mistakes and adapted explanations automatically. I remember one winter night vividly. Rain tapping against the window, cold coffee on the desk, and a moment when the program I'd been testing finally, it felt alive. I sat there staring at the screen for a long time, because for the first time since leaving college, I felt like I wasn't lost. I was building something. That night became the foundation for Summit Learning Technologies. Not a company yet, just a small idea growing quietly in the background of my life. And for years, that's exactly how it stayed. Quiet, unknown, unnoticed, which in some ways felt familiar. Back in the lounge, Marcus leaned forward slightly. "How long did it take before you realized what you had built?" he asked. I smiled faintly. "A while." Because the truth was, success didn't arrive like a fireworks show. It arrived slowly. First one small client, then another, then a corporate training director who told a colleague, then a licensing request from a mid-sized firm. By the time Summit hired its 5th employee, the platform had already spread further than I expected. But through all of it, one thing remained the same. My family never asked, and I never told them. Not because I wanted to hide it, but because, somewhere deep down, I had stopped expecting them to see me differently. Marcus listened quietly as I spoke. Tex. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair with a thoughtful expression. "I think," he said slowly, "you might be underestimating the scale of what you've created." I raised an eyebrow. "Am I?" He gave a soft laugh. "Paige, Sterling Partners just increased our license agreement with Summit last month." "You did?" Marcus nodded. "For 8 figures. And suddenly, the quiet little hallway outside my brother's wedding reception didn't feel quite so small anymore. For a few seconds after Marcus said 8 figures, I honestly thought I had misheard him. The words seemed too large for the quiet lounge we were sitting in. Outside the window, the river moved slowly under the city lights, steady and indifferent, as if numbers like that were completely ordinary. I folded my hands together on the table, partly to keep them from fidgeting. 8 figures is a big license, I said carefully. Marcus watched me with a thoughtful expression. "Yes," he said, "it is." He didn't say it with the tone people usually use when discussing money. No pride, no excitement. Just simple acknowledgement. That alone told me something about him. Most executives I'd met during negotiations loved reminding people how much they were spending. Marcus spoke like someone who understood that the value of something mattered more than the price. "Your platform changed how we train our entire workforce," he continued calmly. 2,000 employees across 3 continents. I exhaled slowly. When Summit first launched, our clients were small consulting firms and tech startups. But even now, I still sometimes thought of the company as that tiny operation above the laundromat. Hearing the numbers out loud, made the growth feel real in a way spreadsheets never quite did. Marcus leaned forward slightly, which is why I was surprised tonight. Surprised. He nodded toward the ballroom doors. The way your brother spoke about you. The sentence hung gently in the air. He hadn't meant it as criticism, just observation. I shrugged lightly, the way people do when they're trying to make something seem smaller than it feels. Garrett's always been the family success story. Marcus didn't respond immediately. Instead, he studied me with the quiet patience of someone piecing together a puzzle. You know, he said finally, when I first met Garrett at Sterling, he talked about his family a lot. That didn't surprise me. Garrett loved telling stories where he was the central character. What did he say? I asked. Marcus hesitated, choosing his words carefully. He described you as someone who had taken a different path. I couldn't help smiling a little. That's a polite way to put it. Marcus gave a small nod, but he never mentioned Summit. I shook my head. No reason to. That was the truth, at least from my perspective. My family didn't follow tech startups. They didn't read industry reports or venture funding news. To them, software companies were vague, distant things that existed somewhere in Silicon Valley, and I had never felt the need to correct their assumptions. Marcus leaned back in his chair. You're aware that Summit's valuation crossed 9 figures this quarter. The number didn't make my heart race the way it might have years earlier. After a while, large figures become abstract, just markers on a graph. Still, hearing it spoken aloud carried a strange weight. I try not to focus on valuation, I said. Marcus smiled. That's probably why it keeps increasing. Before I could respond, the ballroom doors opened down the hall. A burst of music and laughter spilled into the corridor. Guests were beginning to wander out for fresh air or drinks at the lobby bar. Marcus glanced toward the sound. Looks like the reception is moving into the dancing portion of the evening. I followed his gaze. Through the open doors, I could see flashes of movement. People standing, servers carrying trays of champagne, Leela's white dress swirling under the lights. Part of me felt the quiet urge to slip away before anyone noticed I'd been gone. But another part of me was suddenly curious. Because if Marcus Webb knew who I was, if Sterling Partners had invested that heavily in Summit, then it meant something else too. Sooner or later, someone inside that ballroom was going to connect the dots. Marcus seemed to reach the same conclusion. He turned back to me with a small, thoughtful smile. May I ask you something slightly delicate? Go ahead. Did you intentionally keep your work separate from your family? I considered the question. The truth wasn't complicated. Yes, I said softly, but not for the reasons people usually think. Marcus waited. I didn't hide it because I was ashamed, I continued. Stopped expecting them to be interested. The words felt simple, but saying them out loud carried a quiet ache. Marcus nodded slowly, as if he understood more than I had said. Then he surprised me again. Well, he said lightly, standing from his chair, I'm afraid that separation might be ending tonight. I frowned. What do you mean? He gestured toward the ballroom. Several executives from Sterling are here for Garrett's wedding. That made sense. Garrett worked in the corporate strategy division, and Sterling Partners was the kind of firm where business and social circles overlapped constantly. But Marcus's next sentence made my stomach tighten slightly. And at least 3 of them helped negotiate Summit's licensing agreement. I stared at him, and they know what I look like. Marcus's smile carried a hint of amusement. I'm fairly certain they do. Right on cue. A tall man in a navy suit stepped out of the ballroom and looked around the hallway. When his eyes landed on Marcus, his face lit up. Marcus. There you are. The man walked toward us quickly, then stopped when he noticed me. For a brief second, confusion crossed his face. Then recognition hit like a switch flipping. His eyes widened. Well, I'll be damned. Marcus chuckled quietly under his breath. Paige, he said gently, this is Daniel Hargrove. He's one of our senior partners. Daniel stared at me like he'd just discovered a plot twist halfway through a movie. You're Paige Donovan. I nodded slowly. Yes. Daniel ran a hand over the back of his neck and let out a low whistle. Garrett's sister. Marcus folded his arms with mild amusement. That's what the guest list says. Daniel looked back toward the ballroom doors, then back at me, and suddenly his grin grew wider. Oh. This is going to be interesting. My stomach tightened. Why? Daniel gestured toward the reception hall. Because half the leadership team from Sterling is in that room. He paused. And none of them realize the woman who built the platform we've been raving about for months is sitting at table 17. From inside the ballroom, someone called Garrett's name loudly. The band started another upbeat song. Daniel chuckled softly. You might want to come back inside, he said. Trust me. Marcus glanced at me calmly, but his eyes held a quiet question, and for the first time that evening, I felt the strange sense that the night Garrett thought belonged entirely to him was about to shift in a direction no one had planned. Least of all me. I hadn't planned on going back inside. When I stepped out of the ballroom earlier, my only intention was to leave quietly, drive back to the small hotel near the airport, and catch my early flight the next morning. That was usually how family gatherings went for me. Arrive politely, smile when expected, leave before the evening grew uncomfortable. But suddenly, standing in that quiet hallway with Marcus Webb and Daniel Hargrove, something had shifted. Not dramatically, just enough to make me curious. Daniel pushed open the ballroom door, and a wave of warm air and music rushed over us. The band had started playing an energetic swing number, and couples were gathering on the dance floor beneath the glittering chandelier. The room looked even more alive than before. Servers wove between tables carrying trays of champagne. Leela laughed with a group of bridesmaids near the cake display. Nana Sabste. My parents were standing near the head table, speaking with Garrett's new in-laws. For a moment, it felt strange to walk back into the same room where I had just been quietly insulted. But this time, something was different. Marcus walked beside me. Not behind, not ahead, beside. That small detail didn't escape the attention of several people near the entrance. I saw a few curious glances immediately. Marcus Webb wasn't just another guest. He was the CEO of Sterling Partners. When someone like that entered a room, people noticed. Daniel leaned toward Marcus and murmured something quietly, then slipped off toward the bar. Marcus turned slightly toward me. I hope you don't mind staying a little longer, he said gently. I'm not sure what's about to happen, but I suspect it will be enlightening. I raised an eyebrow. You sound very confident about that. He smiled faintly. Let's just say the Sterling team tends to recognize good work when they see it. We had barely taken 5 steps into the room when a woman in a silver dress approached us. She looked to be in her mid-30s, with sharp eyes and the kind of posture that suggested she spent most of her life in boardrooms. Marcus, she said warmly. Then her gaze shifted to me, and she froze. For a second, I could practically see the moment recognition hit her. Oh my God, she said quietly. Marcus chuckled. Good evening, Olivia. Olivia's eyes moved back and forth between us. You're Paige Donovan, she said, almost like she was confirming a rumor. I nodded. Yes, she laughed once in disbelief. This is unbelievable. Marcus tilted his head. You sound surprised. Olivia gestured around the room. Garrett's wedding, she said. Of all places. I could hear the excitement creeping into her voice. You have no idea how many times your platform has come up in our strategy meetings. A man standing nearby turned at the comment. What platform? Olivia waved a hand toward me. Summit Learning Technologies. The man blinked. Then his eyes widened exactly the same way Daniel's had earlier. Wait, you're that Paige. I felt the familiar instinct to minimize things rise again. It's just a training platform, I said quietly. Olivia laughed again. Just a training platform. She shook her head. Marcus, are you hearing this? Marcus folded his arms lightly, watching the interaction with a calm expression. I warned you she tends to underestimate herself. By now, a few more people had drifted closer. Corporate events have a strange gravitational pull. Once one conversation starts drawing attention, others follow quick. Within a minute, 3 more Sterling employees were standing nearby. One of them, a tall man with a bald head and wire, rimmed glasses, stared at me with open curiosity. "You built Summit's adaptive learning engine?" he asked. "Yes," I said. He rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "That algorithm." Across the room, Garrett was standing with a group of his college friends, laughing loudly. At first, he hadn't noticed anything unusual, but then someone from Sterling pointed toward Marcus. Garrett glanced over, and that's when he saw me standing there, with his boss, with several senior executives, talking. I watched his expression change from casual amusement to mild confusion. He nudged one of his coworkers. They both looked again. Meanwhile, the conversation around me continued. Olivia leaned slightly closer. "Do you know how many companies are trying to build something similar right now?" she said. I shrugged. A few. More than a few," she corrected. "But none of them have your adaptive model working at scale." Marcus nodded in agreement. "That's why Sterling expanded the licensing contract." The bald man looked impressed. "I heard that deal was massive." Marcus glanced at me briefly before answering. 8 figures. The number landed like a quiet thunderclap among the group. Even in corporate circles, 8-figure deals had weight. Olivia blinked. "Seriously?" Marcus nodded calmly. Across the room, Garrett had started walking toward us. I could see the slight tension in his shoulders. At first, he probably assumed Marcus was discussing work with someone else. But the closer he came, the clearer the situation became. By the time he reached our group, the conversation had shifted again. One of the executives was asking me about Summit's next development phase. "We're experimenting with predictive skill modeling," I explained. "Instead of just responding to mistakes, the system anticipates learning gaps before they appear." The man looked fascinated. That could change corporate training completely. Garrett stopped beside us. "Marcus," he said. The word carried a polite professionalism, but I could hear the confusion underneath it. "Marcus." Garrett's eyes flicked toward me, then toward the small crowd gathered around us. "What's going on here?" For a moment, no one answered. Not because the question was difficult, because everyone suddenly realized something Garrett clearly did not. Marcus smiled pleasantly. "We were just discussing Summit Learning Technologies." "Oh yeah, I've heard the team talking about that platform." He glanced around. "Who's presenting it tonight?" The silence that followed lasted about 3 seconds. Then Olivia gestured gently toward me. "Your sister." Garrett blinked. "What?" Marcus's voice remained calm. "Paige is the founder of Summit." I watched the exact moment the words landed. Confusion, disbelief, and then something deeper. Garrett laughed once, short and sharp. "Wait, what?" But nobody else was laughing. And for the first time all evening, my brother looked like the least certain person in the room. Garrett kept smiling. But it was the kind of smile people use when they're waiting for someone to admit a joke. His eyes moved from Marcus to Olivia to me. Then back again. "Okay," he said lightly. "Very funny." Nobody responded. The music from the band continued behind us, cheerful and bright, completely unaware that something quiet and significant had just cracked open in the middle of the room. Garrett's smile faded a little. "Seriously," he said. "What's going on?" Marcus didn't rush the moment. He simply turned his head slightly toward me, as if giving me the choice to speak first. But I had spent years not explaining myself, and oddly enough, I didn't feel the need to start now. So Marcus answered. "Paige founded Summit Learning Technologies about 8 years ago," he said calmly. Garrett frowned. "That training platform Sterling uses?" "Yes." Garrett shook his head once, almost like he was trying to reset the conversation. "No, that can't be right." The bald executive from earlier, his name was Victor, I had just learned, spoke gently. "Garrett, the licensing contract literally lists her as founder and lead architect." Garrett looked at him, then at me again. "But she works in tech support or something in Seattle." The sentence landed in the group like a dropped glass. I felt a small, familiar tug inside my chest. Not pain exactly, just recognition, because that assumption had lived comfortably in my family for years, and none of them had ever felt the need to ask further. Marcus tilted his head slightly. "I believe Paige runs a company employing nearly 70 people now." Garrett's brow furrowed deeper. "That doesn't make sense." His voice had dropped lower now, less performative. Why wouldn't I know about that? Olivia gave a small diplomatic shrug. You might want to ask Paige. Garrett turned fully toward me, and suddenly I could see the boy I grew up with beneath the confident executive suit. Confused. Searching. Paige, he said quietly. I held his gaze calmly. Yes. Why didn't you tell anyone? It was a fair question. But the answer wasn't dramatic. It never had been. I never really had the chance, I said. Garrett blinked. What do you mean? I gestured lightly around the ballroom. Family conversations usually focused on your career. Several people nearby shifted uncomfortably. Garrett's jaw. That's not fair. I shrugged gently. It's not unfair either. Marcus watched the exchange with quiet interest but didn't interrupt. Garrett ran a hand through his hair. So you built a company worth, what? Millions? And just never mentioned it. Something like that. Garrett let out a short laugh, but there was no humor in it. This is insane. Victor spoke again, his voice thoughtful. For what it's worth, Garrett, Summit is one of the most impressive training systems I've seen in 20 years. Olivia nodded. We've been analyzing it for months. Garrett looked around the circle, and for the first time since I'd known him, he looked uncertain about his footing. His entire professional world had just overlapped with the one person he had always assumed stood outside it. Across the ballroom, whispers had begun spreading. Weddings have their own version of social currents. News travels quietly from one conversation to another, and a cluster of sterling executives standing around Garrett's sister was suddenly interesting. My cousin Natalie appeared near the edge of the group. Paige, she said. Her eyes moved between us. What's happening? Before I could answer, Olivia smiled politely. We were just discussing Paige's company. Natalie frowned. What company? Marcus replied simply. Summit Learning Technologies. Natalie's eyes widened. Wait, that Summit. Apparently even some of my extended family had heard of it, which made the situation even stranger. Unday. Natalie looked at me like she was seeing me for the first time. You built that. I nodded once. Her mouth opened slightly. Across the room, my parents had begun watching us now. My mother leaned toward my father and said something quietly. Garrett noticed them too, and I could see a flicker of frustration crossing his face. Because the spotlight had shifted, this was his wedding, his celebration, his carefully crafted moment. And suddenly, the conversation in the room wasn't about him anymore. He turned back toward Marcus, trying to regain control. So how big is this Marcus didn't hesitate. 8 figures. Even Garrett, who worked in finance, couldn't fully hide his reaction. His eyebrows lifted. 8. He stopped himself mid-sentence. For the first time, he looked at me not like a younger sister, but like a stranger he needed to reevaluate. You're serious? Marcus nodded. Very. Garrett exhaled slowly. Then he laughed again, but this time it sounded more like disbelief than amusement. Well, I guess that explains a lot. I tilted my head slightly. Like what? Garrett gestured vaguely. Like why you suddenly disappeared after. I didn't disappear, I said quietly. I moved. Another small silence fell between us. Then Marcus spoke again, his tone gentle but deliberate. Garrett, your sister's work is genuinely remarkable. Garrett nodded automatically. Yeah, clearly. But I could see something complicated moving behind his eyes. Not jealousy either. Something more fragile. The unsettling feeling people get when a story they've believed for years suddenly changes. My mother and father had started walking toward us now, slowly, carefully. Like people approaching a conversation they weren't sure how to enter. Marcus noticed them first. Looks like your parents are joining us. Garrett turned. And for a moment, the confident man who had joked about my failures an hour earlier looked strangely small. Because this time, the story being told about me wasn't his. And he had no control over how it unfolded. When my parents reached the group, the music from the band shifted into a slower song. Couples drifted toward the dance floor, the lights dimming slightly around the room. But in the small circle forming near Marcus and the sterling executives, the atmosphere had grown unusually still. My mother looked from Garrett to me, then to the unfamiliar faces surrounding us. Her smile was polite but uncertain. "Is everything all right?" she asked. Garrett cleared his throat. Yeah, it's fine." He gestured toward Marcus. "Mom, Dad, you remember Marcus Webb?" My father straightened immediately, extending his hand. "Of course. Garrett speaks very highly of you." Marcus shook his hand warmly. "The feeling is mutual." Then my mother's eyes landed on me. There was confusion in them, not hostility, just genuine confusion. "Paige," she said gently. Before I could answer, Olivia spoke up. "We were discussing Summit Learning Technologies." My mother blinked. "I'm not sure I've heard of that." Olivia hesitated slightly, glancing at Marcus. Marcus nodded toward me. "Paige founded it." For a moment, the words didn't seem to register. My mother frowned slightly. "Founded what?" Garrett exhaled impatiently. "Apparently Paige built some corporate training platform Sterling uses." "Some platform," Olivia repeated softly. Marcus chuckled under his breath. "Garrett's being modest on Paige's behalf." Victor added calmly, "Summit is currently one of the most advanced adaptive learning systems in the industry." My father looked at me, then at Garrett, then back at me again. "You started a company?" he asked slowly. "Yes." "How long ago?" 8 years. His eyebrows lifted. 8. Garrett rubbed the back of his neck. "Yeah. That's what I said." My mother still looked puzzled. "And what does the company do exactly?" Marcus answered this time. "It helps corporations train employees more efficiently. Paige's platform adapts to each person's learning style in real time." My mother's expression softened slightly. "That sounds nice." Olivia smiled politely. "It's more than nice." Then Marcus added quietly, "Sterling recently expanded our contract with Summit for 8 figures." That was the moment everything shifted. My father's head jerked slightly. 8 figures? "Yes, Dad." My mother looked between us. "I'm sorry," she said slowly, "but are we talking about millions?" Marcus nodded. "Yes." The silence that followed was deeper this time, because it wasn't just surprise anymore. It was realization. My parents turned to look at me again, but now they're like they were trying to reconcile the daughter they thought they knew with the person standing in front of them. My father cleared his throat. "Well, that's certainly impressive." My mother nodded quickly. "Why didn't you ever tell us?" I kept my voice gentle. "You never asked." It wasn't meant to sound accusatory. But the truth has its own weight. My mother looked down at her hands. "I suppose we just assumed." She trailed off. Garrett finished the sentence quietly, that she was still figuring things out. Across the room, more guests had begun glancing our way. Daniel Hargrove was speaking animatedly with 2 other Sterling partners near the bar. One of them suddenly looked toward me with obvious curiosity. Within minutes, 2 more executives drifted over. The circle widened again. "Marcus," one of them said, "is it true?" Marcus smiled. "It is." The man looked at me like he had just spotted a rare artifact. "I've been trying to get my department onto Summit for months." I gave a small nod. "We're expanding our enterprise capacity next quarter." He laughed. "Good, because my team desperately needs it." Garrett stood very still beside me. I could feel the tension in his posture. For years he had been the family member people asked questions about. His promotions, his salary, his big city career. And now, for the first time, the curiosity in the room had shifted. Natalie returned with 2 other cousins. "Is it true?" she whispered. "You're like a tech founder now." I smiled faintly. "Something like that." Natalie shook her head in amazement. "I had no idea." Behind her, I saw my aunt whispering to another relative. Soon several members of the extended family were watching the conversation with open fascination. Garrett noticed it too. His jaw tightened slightly, because he understood something that everyone else was just beginning to realize. This moment wasn't fading quietly. It was spreading. Marcus placed a light hand on my shoulder. "Paige," he said calmly, "I'd actually been hoping to speak with you about something." I turned. "We've been considering a deeper partnership with Summit." Garrett blinked. "Another contract." Marcus nodded. "Possibly." He looked at me thoughtfully. I was hoping we could schedule a meeting while you're still in town. I hesitated. Then I said something that surprised even me. I fly back tomorrow afternoon. Marcus. That gives us the morning. Garrett looked between us. You're having a business meeting during my wedding weekend. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Well, Garrett, I did technically meet Paige here. The comment was polite, but the meaning behind it was clear. Opportunity doesn't pause for social convenience. Garrett opened his mouth to reply, then closed it again, because for the first time that evening, he didn't quite know what role he played in the conversation anymore. The room buzzed softly with new whispers, and standing there beneath the chandelier lights, I realized something unexpected. The humiliation I'd felt earlier had faded. Not replaced by triumph, not by revenge, just clarity. Because my worth had never actually depended on anyone in this room understanding it. And now that they were beginning to see it, it didn't change who I already was. After a while, the attention began to drift away. Not completely, but enough for the reception to return to something that resembled a wedding again. People slowly migrated back toward the dance floor. The band picked up the tempo. Leela's bridesmaids pulled her into a circle of laughter and spinning dresses. Life, as it usually does, continued. And Tim. Marcus eventually excused himself to greet a few other guests, promising to call me later about the morning meeting. The Sterling executives followed one by one, each offering a handshake or a few warm words before they left. Looking forward to working with you again. You've built something extraordinary. My department is definitely reaching out next quarter. Each comment was polite and professional, but together they left a quiet echo behind, because the room had heard them, and so had my family. For a few minutes after everyone drifted away, I stood near the edge of the ballroom alone. Garrett had disappeared somewhere with his groomsmen. My parents were still at the nearby table, speaking softly to each other. I watched the lights from the chandelier ripple across the polished floor, and I realized something strange. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. Mostly, I just felt calm. Like a knot I hadn't noticed for years had finally loosened. A few moments later, my mother approached. She moved slowly, like someone rehearsing a conversation in her mind before it happened. Paige, she said gently. I turned toward her. Yes, she sat down in the empty chair beside me. For a while, she simply watched the dancers on the floor. I didn't know, she said quietly. I know. Her fingers smoothed the edge of the white tablecloth. You should have told us. I looked at her kindly. Mom, when was the last time you asked me about my work? She hesitated. And that hesitation was answer enough. I suppose, she began slowly, we just thought you were still figuring things out. I smiled faintly. I was. Just not in the way they assumed. My father joined us a moment later. He pulled out a chair across from me, his expression thoughtful. I read an article about Summit a few months ago, he said. I didn't realize it was you. That happens a lot. He nodded slowly. I guess we underestimated you. The words weren't dramatic, but they carried a kind of honesty I hadn't heard from him before. It's all right, I said, and surprisingly, it was. Not because their opinion didn't matter, but because it no longer defined anything about me. A little while later, Garrett appeared again. His tie was slightly loosened now, his expression still unsettled. He pulled a chair over and sat down across from me. For a long moment, none of us. Then he exhaled. Well, he said quietly, this is awkward. I chuckled softly. A little. Garrett rubbed his forehead. You should have told me, Paige. You never asked either. He opened his mouth to argue, then stopped, because he knew it was true. After a few seconds, he shook his head. I can't believe you built a company like that. It took time. Garrett leaned back in his chair. Marcus practically worships your platform. I smiled faintly. He seems enthusiastic. Garrett laughed once, though it carried a hint of humility now. You realize half the people in that room just watched my boss call my little sister a genius. That must be strange. Yeah. He looked down at his hands for a moment. Then he said something I didn't expect. I'm sorry about the speech. The words were simple, but genuine. You didn't deserve that. I studied his face carefully. For once, Garrett wasn't performing confidence. He was just being honest. Thank you, I said. He nodded. I guess I got used to the version of you I thought I knew. That happens. Garrett leaned forward slightly. So what now? I considered the question. I said, not much changes, meaning. I go back to Seattle. I keep building Summit and the family stuff. I thought about that carefully. Then I answered truthfully, I'm open to having a better relationship. Garrett's eyebrows lifted slightly. But it has to be real. No more quiet, no more polite dismissal. Just honesty. Garrett nodded slowly. That seems fair. Across the ballroom, Lila waved Garrett back toward the dance floor. Duty calls, he said, standing up. Before he left, he paused. You know, he added thoughtfully, this might be the first time in my life you've completely surprised me. I smiled. It won't be the last. He laughed quietly and walked back toward his bride. I stayed at the table a few minutes longer, watching the celebration unfold. The music. The laughter. The warm glow of the evening. And for the first time in years, being here didn't feel like standing on the outside. Not because the room had finally recognized me, but because I no longer needed it to. A little later, I slipped out of the ballroom once more, this time not to escape. Enter Matt. Enter Matt. Just to breathe the cool night air. The river shimmered beneath the city lights, exactly the way it had earlier, unchanged, steady. I leaned on the balcony railing and allowed myself a small smile. Tomorrow morning, I would meet Marcus to discuss the next phase of Summit. The company's valuation might double. The platform might expand across industries. There would be meetings, negotiations, new hires, long nights of development. The quiet life I'd built would keep growing. But tonight, something simpler had happened. I had finally stepped out of a story that was never really mine. And in its place, I was writing my own. I stayed out on that balcony for a long time. Long enough for the music inside the ballroom to change songs 3 times. Long enough for the laughter drifting through the open doors to soften into the comfortable rhythm of a celebration, settling into its later hours. The river below moved slowly beneath the city lights, quiet and steady. And standing there in the cool night air, I found myself thinking about something that took me years to understand. Sometimes, the people who underestimate you aren't cruel. They're just used to a story. Families are like that. Once a role is assigned, the responsible one, the successful one, the quiet one, the disappointment, it becomes comfortable, predictable. Everyone learns their lines. Garrett had always been the golden child, the confident one, the one everyone expected big things from. And me, I had been the sister who dropped out. The one still figuring things out. For a long time, I believed that story too. Not completely, but enough that I stopped correcting it. Because here's something I learned the hard way. When people already think they know who you are, they rarely ask deeper questions. And if you're not careful, you can spend years shrinking yourself to fit the version of you they understand. But life has a quiet way of changing those stories. Not through dramatic revenge, not through humiliating the people who doubted you. Just through living your life well, through building something meaningful. Through learning your own value. Even when nobody else is paying attention yet. That night at Garrett's wedding, the truth finally surfaced in a room full of people who had misunderstood me for years. But strangely enough, the most important part wasn't their reaction. Not the surprise, not the whispers, not even Garrett's apology. The important part was realizing something I had slowly learned long before that night. My worth had never belonged to them. It was never theirs to give, and it was never theirs to take away. Recognition is nice, respect is meaningful, but peace comes from something quieter, from knowing who you are, even when nobody else does. The next morning I met Marcus for breakfast just as planned. We spent 3 hours discussing Summit's next phase. New markets. New markets. New partnerships. New possibilities. By the end of the meeting, the valuation Marcus mentioned had nearly doubled. But the most valuable thing I walked away with wasn't the business opportunity. It was the quiet confidence that comes from being seen for what you've truly built. And interestingly enough, my family did start asking more real questions about my work, about my life, about the company. Some relationships slowly changed, some stayed exactly the same, and I learned to be okay with both, because growth doesn't always mean everyone around you grows at the same pace. Sometimes it simply means you stop waiting for permission to be who you already are. So now I'm curious about something. If you were in my place, would you have told your family the truth sooner? Or would you have done exactly what I did and simply let your life speak for itself? I'd really love to hear what you think. Tell me in the comments. And if stories like this resonate with you, stories about quiet strength, family, and finding your own worth, make sure you subscribe and support the channel, because sometimes the most powerful victories are the ones that happen without anyone realizing it, at least not until it's already too late to rewrite the story.